Rubio.
Thank you both. Just to continue to build on this line, if you could just, obviously people around the country are looking at our own economic struggles here at home. They see our commitments abroad, both in treasure and in lives and in blood and people coming back wounded and so forth. And so there's always this fundamental question of why doesn't everyone else do more? Why are we committed to these things? Why are we 70, 60 years after the end of the Second World War still engaged in Asia and providing defense assistance to Japan and South Korea? Why do we need NATO anymore? These are rich countries. They should be able to pay for their own defense. And so I would ask both of you to describe a world in which NATO lost its way or perhaps even disintegrated, and a world where Japan and South Korea lost U.S. commitment. What would the world look like if what would the strategic environment look like in Asia, for example, if the U.S. nuclear umbrella no longer covered Japan and South Korea? And what would the world look like if NATO substantially was diminished or even disintegrated?
Well, it would be far less stable. You would have many, many more. We've got a lot of, as Tom and I both said, we got a lot of problems today, but you'd have a hell of a lot more if that were the case. And these commitments that we have around the world promote U.S. security, because to the extent that things, ever since the end of World War II, our security alliances with Japan and South Korea have been the foundation and the basis for peace and stability in the Pacific. NATO has been the foundation and the base for peace and stability in Europe and on the Eurasian continent.
But some would say, some have suggested, why don't you just let Japan and South Korea get their own nuclear weapons and let them defend themselves?
I think that the more countries that acquire nuclear weapons, the more instability there's going to be in the world, in my opinion. If you look at the way North Korea is using its nuclear capabilities, that's all it's got. That's its threat. That's its big card. And it plays it. And ever since the end of World War II, America has led the fight against the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, weapons that can kill millions and millions of people. We ought not to abandon that fight. That would not promote stability. That would promote instability.
Senator Rubio, I think this is a really important thought experiment, right, and an analytical exercise, I think, is to think about what would happen if, in fact, that these norms and institutions and United States-led operations weren't there, right? And Asia, I think, as Secretary Baker said, for 70 years, we've invested in a platform in Asia on which Asia's prosperity and economic development has been built. And if you do the thought experiment, do you really see over the last 3/4 of a century the spread of democracy in Asia? Would you have seen that prosperity in Asia? And I think absent that, you would have seen a proliferation of nuclear weapons in Asia, absent the United States' presence and absent the United States' reassurance to those countries and the building the platform on which the social and economic development has been built. And NATO is another example of this, of course. It's been tremendously successful. We sit here today and we take for granted, it's in some ways a memory problem. We take for granted that Europe is stable, peaceful, and prosperous. That's not the history of Europe. Absent the kinds of institutions that were put in place, and it should never be taken for granted that these are permanent situations, absent really tending to them on a constant basis. So I think the thought experiment you asked us to do is a really important one, and I think the outcomes are clear.
Yeah, it's not just a thought experiment, it's actually been proposed, but let me just talk about but for purposes of this committee, it's a thought experiment. Just to be clear, I don't support doing that. I just want to revisit this Libya-Syria situation for a moment, because I think it's sometimes misconstrued. We didn't start the uprising in Libya, and we didn't start the uprising in Syria. The Syrian people stood up against Assad, actually peacefully at the beginning, and then were met with violence. And the people of Libya stood up to Muammar Gaddafi. And I think there's a very compelling argument to be made that in both cases, neither one of those leaders were going to be able to hold on to power in the long term unless they did what Gaddafi was going to do and Assad is doing now, and that is massacre people in order to hold on to power. And so I think there was a valid argument to be made at the time that if you had foresight, you would say to yourself, these dictators are in trouble. The only way they can hold on to power is to massacre people. If they do so, it is going to lead to chaos and instability. And in the Middle East, chaos and instability in any part of that region is the basic ingredient necessary for Islamic radical jihadists to come in and take advantage of that environment. And so I think it's just important when we talk about that situation to remind ourselves that these were not efforts by the U.S. government to go in and overthrow dictators. It is the people of those countries that stood up against them. It is now we now had to make a decision about what would be in our best interest if you were able to think 3 steps forward. In the case of Gaddafi, if he had gone into Benghazi, massacred all those people, all you would see emerge there would have been all these militias taking up arms, staying in perpetuity, leading to the kind of instability we see now anyways. But it's an accurate assessment to say that we didn't start that. We were left to now analyze what is the best thing forward for us to do within our national interest. And I made the argument at the time, and continue to stand by those arguments, that it was in our national interest to ensure that whatever resistance there was to those dictators would be made up of people more stable whom we could work with, because in the absence of those sorts of elements, that vacuum would be filled by the radical elements that have now filled those vacuums in the absence of our leadership.
But that's not what happened, Senator.
Oh, I agree. It's not what happened.
I mean, and yes, the people were beginning to stand up, but we enabled it to happen by using our military force to go in there and remove those dictators. Same thing in Iraq. I mean, I don't suggest that this is not a bipartisan problem. It's a bipartisan problem. But look where we are in all 3 of those places: Syria, Iraq, Libya. Would we have been there had we not done those things? I'm not sure we would have. In fact, I don't think we would have. Now,
You don't believe that, you believe Assad would have crushed the rebellion against them and recaptured control of the entire country?
I'm not sure whether that would have happened or not, but I guarantee you that I don't think that we would have the situation that we have today. You know, for years we used Saddam Hussein against Iran. When I was Secretary of State, we worked with Saddam Hussein. We finally ended up fighting a war with him, but we worked with him, trying to bring him into the community of nations. But he was our buffer against the interests of Iran. You know what the most important country today in Iraq is? Not the United States with our humongous big embassy there. It's Iran. Most important outside power in Iraq today is Iran. And I don't think it's not my view that the Libyan people were going to be able to throw Gaddafi over unless we and the Europeans, of course they were the real movers, went in there and did it.
Sure, but you would have had a protracted conflict within that country that would have served as a magnet for radical jihadists to come in and do what they're doing now.
Well, as more of a magnet than what we got now with a failed state?
Sure, but the same. And that's the point. We should have empowered elements there potentially to provide some level of stability after the fact. That obviously didn't happen.
We should have.
We started the conflict. We didn't follow through. It left the vacuum. The vacuum's now been filled by ISIS in the northern part of the country. The same is true now in Syria.
We should have done that in all 3 of the places.
We agree. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been fascinating. Thank you both for your time. I want to continue to probe this question of